What's going on, Lions fans? Welcome to the Pride of Detroit YouTube channel. My name is Miko, and this is your go-to place for all things Lions related. That includes news, updates, analysis, and so many more other things. Today, we will be once again continuing our Detroit Lions roster preview series that originally started over on the POD website. Now, if you haven't had a chance to check out this series, in this series, we are basically taking a look at various members of the Lions roster and taking a look back at what they were able to do in 2024, as well as the expectations that we had for those players, and then basically going through what they were actually able to accomplish and how that should impact what they could be doing in the 2025 series. We've done this, like I said, for so many other players over on the website. We are now bringing this series over to the YouTube side of things as well and going to cover a couple of players here. So if you want to see this series in its entirety, I highly suggest that you go over to the Pride of Detroit website, which will be linked in the description of this video, so that you can catch any players that may not be covered over here on this YouTube channel. So far, we've only covered Jared Goff, but today we'll be covering our first defensive player, and that player being Terrion Arnold. Now, the name Terrion Arnold probably is going to bring up a different emotion depending on who you are as a Lions fan. There were a number of fans that were very happy when the Lions drafted Terrion Arnold last year. He was sought after as, or he was at least seen as, one of the top corners in the draft, and many people, myself included, didn't think that he would actually be in play for the Lions for where they were drafting. However, based on how that draft ended up going, not just Terrion Arnold, but a number of the secondary players in that draft saw themselves slide into the later parts of the draft, and the Lions were fortunate enough to be able to pick him up. And the reason I say, depending on who you are, you may feel differently about him going into year two is because I think there were some people that saw, one of the top corners sliding into the draft and falling to the Lions as an instant win and something that was going to translate instantly to success for this team and for him as a player onto the field. I think there were other players, and this is where or other people, and this is where I would put myself, that also understood that while Terrion was a highly sought after corner in the draft, he was still very much a rookie, and that was going to come with a certain level of bumps and bruises along the way, and that there was going to be a learning curve for him, no matter how dominant he was in the draft. Anytime you have a player that's sought after as one of the best of his position, go from being potentially a top 10 pick all the way down to the 20s, that should tell you that from a technique standpoint, there is something lacking there. Of course, there's always the possibility that there were just better players at other positions, but I think as Lions fans saw throughout the season, Terrion is not the perfect player. He wasn't the perfect prospect, but that doesn't mean that he can't still achieve all the things that many draft analysts thought that he could eventually be when you look at his size, his speed, and just his overall ability to play the position at a really high level. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into the expectations that we had for Terrion headed into that 2024 season. And like I was saying already, I think the expectations, depending on who you are as a fan, were probably fairly high. Whenever you have a guy, like I said, that's highly sought after or highly ranked in the draft process at his position, most people think, okay, this person's going to start and they're probably going to play at a high level. And I don't think that's necessarily the fault of Terrion. I think when you look back at some of the most recent drafts that the NFL has had, and some of the corners that were selected in the first round. Specifically, you talk about Sauce Gardner, you talk about Pat Surtain. Even though those guys were drafted much higher than Terrion was, I think there's still that belief that when you are getting a corner in the first round, that you should be getting someone that can heavily contribute. And so I think that was very much the expectation from the fans' perspective on what Terrion would be going into the 2024 season. And I think even when you look at the Lions coaching staff, they themselves had high expectations for him as well. They as well were praising him for, like I said, his technique, his ability to, be just an amazing athlete with his size and speed combination, and everything that he was able to accomplish at Alabama, one of the more pristine colleges when it comes down to churning out defensive talent. So when you start to look at, okay, well, then what else did the coaching staff have to say about him? I think this quote from Aaron Glenn kind of says it perfectly. During one press conference last year, AG was asked point blank, what were his expectations for Terrion going into the season? And he basically said, my expectation for him is to be a damn good football player in this defense because it fits who he is. Like, that's not mincing words in any kind of way. AG and this defensive staff had a very high expectation of Terrion coming in, but it goes beyond just AG, just again, being kind of straightforward for that. We also even got to hear from Ben Johnson during training camp last year, and he even gave some insight into how Terrion was performing in training camp at that time, where he says, yeah, he's sticky. He's sticky as all get out. So he's given us some issues there during training camp, one-on-ones, and we've tried to pick on him a little bit, and it hasn't been as super successful. So I'm encouraged to see where he's at. He certainly lets you know he's out there in more ways than one. Terrion is someone that definitely was exuding confidence at that time. And you look at a quote like this and you kind of start to get an idea of those types of skill sets that he was showing in college, at least starting to show up in moments at various points throughout training camp last year. So again, this really helps set the stage for a lot of people to have high expectations for him going into the regular season. Now, fast forward to once the season started, well, things probably didn't go as well as they were looking in training camp when you start to break down not just his stats, but just, again, watching the games as they were playing out, especially those first 8 games. So in totality, Terrion ended up playing 16 games last year. He did miss 1 game due to injury. He ended up having 10 pass breakups on the season, 60 total tackles, no interceptions on the year, but he was able to force a 55% completion percentage as well as a 93.7 passer rating against him. He also played the most man-to-man coverage amongst corners in the NFL, not just rookies, but flat out corners in the NFL. Terrion was playing the most man-to-man snaps throughout that year at 239 snaps played. Going over to the PFF side of things, that's where things really you can kind of see the struggles that Terrion was having. He only was able to register a 51.5 defensive grade. When you break that up between the first 8 games of the season, he had 55.1 as a grade. His last 8 games did get better at a 58.1. The same can be said for his pass coverage grade. He initially finished the season with the 50.4, but if you break that up between the first 8 games and the second 8 games, first 8 games, 54.8, last 8 games, 57.4. It's not a huge amount of progress, right, when we're talking about these scores, but it is at least a sign that Terrion was starting to get better, which was a lot of the things that the coaching staff was starting to see and a lot of things that were showing up when you actually watch those games. One of the things that I think a lot of people were frustrated with him about in those first 8 games was the penalties that he was racking up. Terrion was almost like a walking pass interference or defensive holding in so many games last year. You look at those first 8 games and he was penalized 8 times in those first 8 games, but you see that he started to get more comfortable. He started to trust his technique. He started to trust the things that had him be a first round draft pick. And by the last 8 games of the season, he was only penalized twice. That to me shows growth. That shows the ability to understand who you are as a player and understand and take on the coaching that you're getting. I think one thing that people constantly forget when it comes down to, corners and safeties or just anyone that plays, in the secondary on the defensive side is that those players, while they may be studs at the college level, while they may be the guys that are rarely allowing catches, while they may not be giving up touchdowns, while they may not be racking up, penalties and things like that, the NFL game is entirely different. These NFL quarterbacks know how to attack you completely different than the guys at the college level. These receivers are more talented. They're bigger, stronger, faster, all of the things. And so there's always going to be a learning curve. And Terrion unfortunately had to learn that the hard way. Now, I think for some fans, that's was easier to understand than others. And I think there's some people that are going to go into 2025 and say, hey, Terrion's going to have to prove it. He's going to have to show that he's grown, that he's matured, that he's, taken the things that hurt him last year and has gone into the offseason and worked on his craft in a very serious way. And when you talk to Deshae Townsend, that's exactly what he's noticed and what he's been able to see from Terrion early in this offseason process. And he said this, just conversating throughout the process. Before he got back, then he grabbed me right now. We were in the office watching tape just now. He is trying to be the best player he can be. That's what it takes. You have to work on your craft. You have to find out how you can get better in the offseason, and he's working on that. Terrion is someone that I think is very self-aware. And like most corners, they're very confident in their abilities. But a season like that, where you are getting picked on quite a bit in the secondary and you're constantly being seen as the guy that they can go against, whether to get an easy reception or to get a penalty against, that takes a certain amount of self-reflection. And from according to what Coach Townsend is saying, Terrion has done that self-reflection. So going into 2025, I do expect him to be better. I do expect him to make that jump. And it also is going to help that the Lions went out and got DJ Reed to kind of solidify that CB1 role again. So to give Terrion a little bit more time to adjust to this position, because this is a different NFL than years past. Wide receiver twos in this league are just as dangerous as some wide receiver ones. Obviously, there's some exceptions. Obviously, there are some wide receiver ones that are just completely out of this world, but there's a number of teams that have very capable wide receiver twos. So just because Terrion doesn't have the CB1 label as of right now doesn't mean that he's going to have a week off going throughout the rest of the season. It's also worth noting that with Ennis Rakestraw at least being healthy going into training camp this year, he may be also being pushed a little bit more than he was last year, because the Lions, for the most part, they had Carlton Davis, they had Terrion. Ennis Rakestraw Jr. was dealing with an injury for most of last year. Emmanuel Mosley was once again still recovering from an injury as well. So there wasn't a lot of true competition for Terrion last year. That is going to be very different this year. And I think that could also be the push that he needs to continue to get better and continue to hone his craft, because he knows that someone like Ennis Rakestraw Jr. is just as capable of being a starting corner in this league. So he can't just go out this like he did last year and have this many bad weeks. He can't afford to be going out there racking up penalties or giving up big catches and things like that. The Lions have a much more fleshed out secondary, at least as of right now, going into the offseason, with DJ Reed, Meek Robertson, Terrion Arnold, and Ennis Rakestraw Jr. as well in the wings. That's going to be a very competent room. And if Terrion can continue to learn from those veterans that are in that room and continue to allow his physical traits and trust his technique to lead him, I think we can see a much better corner going throughout the rest of the season. I think we'll see someone that was much better, like we did at the end of last season, at the beginning of this season. But those are just my thoughts when it comes down to Terrion Arnold and what I think Lions fans should expect from him going into next season. But I want to hear from you guys in the comment section below. What are your thoughts on Terrion Arnold? Do you think he still has time to right the ship and actually make that big year two jump that we hear coaches always talk about? Or do you think this might be just who he is as a player? I would love to hear that from you guys down below. Also, like I said at the top of this video, if you are looking to continue following along with this series, I highly suggest you check out prideofdetroit.com. The link is in the description. That'll take you over to the website. And like I said, there are so many other players that we've done this with, and there will be a couple more that we'll make sure to highlight over here on the YouTube side. And if you want to stay locked in to the YouTube channel to be able to see those videos when they drop, all you got to do is hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and that's going to make it that much easier for you guys to follow along with our content as we publish it. So with all that said, I'm Miko. Thank you guys for taking the time to watch, and I'll see you guys in the next one.